Hi, this is Matt at State of Flux with a spoiler review for Spider-Man No Way Home. The movie's been out for a week now, so I finally feel ready to dive in. Because if you haven't seen it after a full week, full calendar week, then spoilers probably not big on your radar. I am going to be spoiling the shit out of this movie, so if you do not want spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home, this is the time to hop off the video and come back after you do see it. Alright, spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Actually, we're going to wait on spoilers a little bit longer because I want to dive in to what I thought about the movie. So in my first review that I threw up, it was my immediate gut response reaction, and I was kind of hesitant to give it a star rating out of 4. I was still in the euphoric state, and I still very much am. This movie is an absolute gem. I would give this movie a very strong 3.5 stars, almost 4 stars, after giving it much consideration. I'll dive into some of my criticisms here and there. But what worked best for me is that this film really is the origin story for Peter Parker in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The origin story for Spider-Man that we never got. And I say that knowing full well that this is the 3rd installment or 6th entry in his cinematic mythos for the MCU, but it really feels like this is the first one that dives deep into Spider-Man himself. If Spider-Man Homecoming was about Peter Parker learning to stand tall in a world full of heroes, and Spider-Man Far From Home was Peter Parker learning that he is Tony Stark's legacy and all that entails, then this movie is really about Peter Parker learning to rely on himself to get him through the dark times. And they utilize the other Spider-Men to really hang that picture on. The fact that Peter Parker doesn't rely on the other Avengers this time around. He starts out that way, and we'll go into that, but it's really when he relies on the other Peters, different reflections of his own personal reality that he is living. These are him in other dimensions, but it's really just him, and him learning to trust himself and his own abilities. That is what this movie is about, and that is why I say this is an origin story, the origin story we never got for this incarnation of Spider-Man. Let's just go through the whole movie, because there's so much to unpack here, and so much I wanted to talk about that I really couldn't the first time around. So let's dive deep, let's have fun with this. The movie starts with the tail end of the previous movie, allowing the recap of Mysterio's dark plan. And here's the first thing I wanted to say. I was really excited to see a brief cameo from the end of the movie with Mysterio, and I was fully convinced Mysterio was gonna, based on the trailers and stuff and how kind of unusual Doctor Strange was acting, I didn't think that was Doctor Strange. I was fully convinced that was Mysterio manipulating everything. But that turned out not to be the case. And part of me loved that because I do think that it is important, and this movie does kind of hit it home with this fact that mortality should remain mortal. And we've already gotten several characters who have been revived in the MCU in a very harrowing and beautiful finale with Endgame, and also various other movies in the MCU. But what they've not been good at or consistent with is allowing death to remain final. And so even though I was really bummed to not see any more Mysterio, I love Jake Gyllenhaal in that character, I love the utilization of that character, it did kind of work for me that he wasn't back and there was no tricks to this film. It is exactly as promised that this is going to be a multiverse collide. So, you're given that brief little recap. and then you see Spider-Man and MJ swinging from rooftop to rooftop to flee the like cameras that are now on him in the pursuit of the law enforcement who are trying to capture Peter, who has now been outed as the Spider-Man. And that storyline, here's the worst part of Spider-Man No Way Home is the first half hour. And it's not that any of it is particularly bad, it just feels a little sloppy in comparison. And this is something that happened with all three of the Watts films. They've had an uneven tone and an uneven pacing that didn't make the films gel. Some of them gel better than others. I think Homecoming, even though there's some material there you could shake out of the film, is far more consistently strong than Far From Home was. Far From Home, I think the first hour is kind of a trudge, in all honesty. It's not bad, it's just the definition of meh. The last hour, once Mysterio does his heel turn, is really, really quite strong. This film, the first half hour, it felt very much like that first hour of Far From Home, and I was a little concerned with where we were going. It's once the bad guys begin to reveal themselves that the movie does really pick up. But we'll get to that. So, people are in pursuit of Peter Parker, and he and MJ and Ned are not able to live their lives as they once were. Same thing with Aunt May. And so what does Peter and MJ do? They flee to the safety of home with Aunt May, and stumble in on them breaking, Aunt May and Happy Hogan breaking up. This was another thing that I wasn't in love with. I think it would have been a stronger film to have them remain in love, because you didn't really get a whole lot of her not being into the relationship, except for one kind of well-placed line at the very end of Far From Home. But really, you felt like that was a genuine relationship. And I would have liked that to continue more in this film. I think it would have added more heft and weight to the film, rather than just a throwaway joke early on in the picture. So that was another part of the uneven quality of the film. But as I said, the trio of friends are left in disarray, as is Aunt May, and to a lesser extent, Happy Hogan, because of their relationship with this boy, Peter Parker. Peter's taken in for questioning, just so they can set up a brief cameo when Peter has to lawyer up with Matt Murdock, the Daredevil. And I'm just going to say this up front, Daredevil is my favorite MCU TV show. I guess the first season anyway. I think the only other show that Marvel just absolutely had a grand slam with was WandaVision. I think the first season of Daredevil and the series of WandaVision are two of the strongest properties that Marvel has ever put to celluloid. They are that good. And a large part has to do with Charlie Cox being as effing amazing in that role as he is. He is so incredibly, groundbreakingly good. And that the writing for that whole first season is a masterpiece. Daredevil is one of the comic book characters that got me interested in reading comic books. In large part because Kevin Smith, who I was a fan of, particularly in my high school years, had written for Daredevil, so I started reading Daredevil and Spider-Man comics because of Kevin Smith in a lot of ways. And Smith's Daredevil run, it also included Mysterio. It all comes full circle, folks. But Daredevil is one of my favorite comic book characters. Gun to my head, probably my favorite Marvel comic book character, like as in the comics. And in the films and television, not necessarily quite as much. I think some of the other characters have a little bit on him. But in terms of the comic book material, he is great. He's the only hero who's known for what he can't do. And that always appealed to me. Also, his name's Matt. My name is Matt. We there's far fewer of us in media than you'd expect, and that kind of is disappointing. So I always took a liking to him for that. So that being said, his involvement in this movie is completely dismissible, and grinds the film literally to a halt for 2 minutes so that this dude can have a cameo where he just feels incredibly shoehorned into a property, and it just didn't work for me. Now I know that Marvel has done cameos like this in the past where they work in Hawkeye into Thor for a brief cameo just so that they can include him in Avengers the following year, and it's not going to be as jarring, but those cameos don't necessarily work for me so much. Same thing with Daredevil. It was great seeing that my time spent with him watching the Netflix show wasn't time wasted, because he apparently is going to be a character that will carry on in the future. But it did nothing at the service of this film, and I think Marvel does better when they weave characters in much more like Black Widow was in Iron Man 2, where she actually has a service, a role, a purpose, and a impact in the story as it unfolds. Or, much better example would be Spider-Man himself in Captain America Civil War. So when we saw Daredevil, I thought maybe there's no way they're going to put Matt Murdock in this movie and then not have him in the suit. And I thought maybe he would show up in the climax as one of Pete's friends. Or allies or something, you know what I mean? The Daredevil Spider-Man camaraderie in the comic books was something that I always really appreciated. So I thought we were going to actually get that in this movie, and I was kind of disappointed that we didn't. And the fact that we didn't really makes that scene early on truly egregious and disappointing. If I were to do anything with this movie, it would be shake a few things out, let them drop, because this is a near perfect movie that has the biggest flaw, and the biggest flaw is that it's 2 hours and 45 minutes or whatever, and it feels its length. This movie's about the same length as Avengers Infinity War, and Infinity War didn't feel long. This movie feels long, and that's because there's lumberous scenes that you could literally shake out of the movie and cut the runtime down by 15 minutes easy. This would be one of those examples. It's a great little Easter egg for us fans who did spend so much time watching that Daredevil show, but it does nothing at the service of this film, and Peter Parker's law troubles are never examined once again afterwards. So, I think I've spent enough time bashing Matt Murdock. That said, I am excited to see his presence in the MCU, and I hope it wasn't just for an egregious cameo. And in this, I want to see him be utilized in another property later on. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings also takes place in New York. It would be kind of cool to see him, Daredevil, intertwined with that, because he does have some ties with the Hand and stuff like that. Is that going to be somebody who works with the Ten Rings? I don't know. That could be a story to tell. I would love to see Daredevil in the mix there. So after Peter's problems start compounding on top of himself, he decides to do what he always does, and that is rely on his big buddy Avenger pals to get him through the problem. He, in the first, ever since his inclusion in Civil War, he has been like a kid invited to play with the grown-ups, right? And he thinks very much more of his relationship with Tony Stark than Tony thought. And then it ends up being very much true that their relationship was a bond that neither of them necessarily knew how strong that bond was. But he keeps trying to rely on himself in Homecoming, but can't, because he's so tethered to trying to impress Tony. And he wants Tony to solve his problems in a lot of ways. In Far From Home, he's trying to flee from his Spider-Man self and keeps getting caught up with the Nick Fury of it all, and then kind of relies on Nick Fury to help him bail get himself bailed out of trouble once Mysterio's heel turn happens. So what does he do? He has another friend in the Avengers that he worked with, that he fought alongside and created a slight bond with, and that would be Doctor Strange. And when all these problems happen, he sees a little flickering light of a witch's hat, and he's like, I'm gonna reach out to my warlock buddy, and to fix everything, fix all my problems in one fell swoop. In a very Peter Parker kind of move. And so he does. Peter goes to Strange and wants to make everybody forget about Peter Parker being Spider-Man. And Wong is resistant to this. I liked seeing Wong and how much screen time he's been having since that first Doctor Strange movie. He's a fun character, and I'd like to see more of him. Always. Excellent actor. Benedict Wong, I believe the dude's name is. He's great. He's a great presence in these movies, and I want to see more of him. So I was happy to see him there. But Spidey deals with Cumberbatch, Doctor Strange, who agrees to do the spell, starts doing the spell, but Peter keeps on adjusting it, as we've seen in all the previews, and so finally Doctor Strange just shuts it down. He's like, we can't do this. Though you keep changing it, I'm going to self-contain this problem into this tiny little box, because you can't be trusted with magic. You have to have clear rules to the magic, and you keep changing them. And so Peter, dejected, leaves, and he runs into his person that he's trying to get into college with on the road. He needs to impress her organically now. That said, story beat that we missed was Ned, MJ, and Peter are not included in college because of their proximity to Peter, or Peter being a point of concern himself, being the Spider-Man. So Peter goes like heart in hand, trying to talk to this person to get him included on the roster, if not him, his friends at the very least. And that's when the boom, boom, boom from the trailer starts, and the reveal of Dr. Octopus. In a neat little battle scene, has Spider-Man in the Stark suit fighting Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2, and this is indeed Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2, taken mere moments from his reversal of character. He's the villain throughout Spider-Man 2 because he's being driven by that chip in his head having not worked, and he's getting controlled by the tentacles that he's controlling himself. And he's taken right before the "listen to me now" moment. So he hasn't had his moment to turn back around. So Doc Ock is battling the new Spider-Man, pulls off his mask and reveals that this isn't the Spider-Man that he knows, and he's in abject confusion. And his armor, his tentacles, gets plated with the armor from the Stark technology, the nanotech that is Peter's suit. And now a Stark-powered Doc Ock is an incredibly dangerous thing. So Spider-Man and Doc Ock have a battle. He ends up saving that admissions officer woman that he was trying to talk to when he fully incapacitates Doc Ock using his own intelligence of how that nanotechnology works. It's really cool, but that's when the other one comes. And Green Goblin, taken mere moments before Green Goblin's death in the first Spider-Man movie, comes into play. And that's when Doctor Strange realizes something is wrong. And all of them are transported into the Sanctum Sanctorum, or whatever, in the basement of there. And Doc Ock is held prisoner. Green Goblin got away. Spider-Man is talking with Doctor Strange and is told that when he started altering the spell, anybody who knew Peter Parker started to merge, that Peter Parker was Spider-Man started to merge with this universe. So, therefore, there are other people that are coming through. They just need to find them and send them back. So that's the setup. And this is where the movie gets quite exquisite. Peter invites MJ and Ned into the fold because they can be of use for him, and Spider-Man continues to rely on his friends to get him through his troubles. He goes swinging through to the night and with a souped-up suit from Doctor Strange, and we see the cool black suit, which turns out to just be the regular red and blue suit, just flipped inside out because he got paint thrown at him. I thought that was kind of a clever piece of of marketing that was misdirected. It was pretty cool. Anyway, he encounters another variant that came through, and that is the variant of Electro, who shows up in his blue form in the beginning before he starts getting charged by this world, and this world's energy runs differently. Of course it does, because we've seen how Tony Stark powers New York City with his arc reactor technology, which they don't have in the Garfield universe. So Electro starts visibly changing, and Spider-Man needs help to take down Electro, and who comes? But Sandman. And this is one of the best aspects of the movie, because the characterization that we got with these villains doesn't change from where they were in the previous installments. We get a Norman Osborn Green Goblin that is Golluming the whole time, and in this, I think they even do it better than in the very first Spider-Man movie, him flitting back and forth between the Osborn and the Goblin. You have Doc Ock, who is charged by these tentacle things that are controlling him, but once he gets his own intellect back to him, he is able to recognize the good quality of person that was in that man. We must remember that moments after he gets taken in the storyline of this film, if you were to continue Spider-Man 2, he does not want to die a monster. He wants to die a man. This is a man of intellect that sees his own problem. And that carries through into this film. Sandman and Spider-Man come to a truce at the end of Spider-Man 3 in a kind of beautiful moment. And so when Sandman gets involved in this, it's not as a villain on any level. It is as a hero who's trying to help Spider-Man take down a villain that he sees that's obviously about to practice villainy. And that, I thought, was kind of unique. The Lizard... So, the characterization of the Lizard was never very good in The Amazing Spider-Man. But what this does to redeem some of my problems with that is it humanizes him a little more. And even though he's probably the most underused out of all the villains that are welcomed back in this film, I like that there is just a hint of humanity there. And with Electro, he feels slighted by Spider-Man. It is obsessed with this power of the world that he has around him. And he never had a redemptive arc in his own movie, Amazing Spider-Man 2, and that carries through. He is the arch-villain of the bunch that's just strictly a bad guy because he's looking out for his own wares, you know what I mean? But the real shining achievement of the film is the Green Goblin. Willem Dafoe's performance is extraordinary. This is one of the best performances I've seen him put out in a long time, and that's saying something. This is the man from the Florida Project who was nominated for Best Actor a couple of years ago. He's done The Lighthouse or any number of things, really. You could name any movie he's in, he is always giving 110%, but he takes a character we're familiar with from 3 previous films and really just fills him with pathos when he's Norman Osborn that really just tugs at your heart. And then also is the most arch villain of all of Spider-Man's mythos. And of course he's going to be the main bad guy. It's brilliant. And so in character. I loved it. So anyway, we see how all these characters get introduced to the fold. They're put back into the prisons, and the last one he's find is Norman Osborn, who breaks his mask in a probably smart move because he's always been much more threatening without it, but also he's more sympathetic without it. And so I think that was one of the smart things this movie did. This movie kind of Last Jedi'd us, right? We're familiar with the mask, and he just shatters it. He breaks this mask. And fanboys on the net lost their minds. But I dug it. You need to have that character really shine through without anything covering his face. And probably one of the highlights of the film, Aunt May is the one that finds Norman and reaches out to Peter for help. And the use of Aunt May throughout the film, in every scene after the one with Matt Murdock, is perfect. She is what she hasn't been in the previous two movies, and that is the point of guidance in Peter's life. Peter Parker has always had a relationship with Aunt May where she is the unknowing guardian of this boy with extraordinary powers. And without realizing it, she's always imparting wisdom to him that he utilizes to make his choices in his life. It's not always been Uncle Ben. It's been Ben and May that really shape his life in the movies. In the comics, Uncle Ben really didn't have much involvement at all. It was the movies that gave him the "with great power comes great responsibility" line. In the comics, it was just Peter's narrator that gave that epic tome. And so I really liked how they used May in this as the point of guidance for Peter. And Marissa Tomei is a tremendous actress, and she sells it 100% of the time. She convinces Peter that Norman needs help. And if Norman needs help, maybe all these people need help. Just because they're a bad guy or have made bad choices doesn't mean that they need to be put down or sent back to a world where they're just going to die. And her assertion of this really tickles Peter. And Peter finds a way to agree with that and utilizes that and wants to make good on that promise. Doctor Strange doesn't see it the same way. These people are Varens. They need to get back home. And Peter doesn't see it the same way. The two have an epic battle inside Doctor Strange's mirror universe thing. And Peter is forced to use his own intellect to defeat one of the most powerful Avengers. And he uses math. And this is the first time we've really seen this Peter demonstrate his intelligence. We've seen previous Peters demonstrate their intelligence, but this scene is excellent because he logics his way out of the situation in a way that isn't like, have you seen this really old movie? Like he did in Infinity War and in Civil War. This is him being smart for himself. And I loved that. And he traps Doctor Strange in his own mirror dimension, and Peter's going to go and he's going to solve the big problem. He's going to cure them all of their predicaments. And so Peter, using some of the help of Stark technology and stuff like that, really comes up with this kind of brilliant idea on how to cure everybody with the help of the scientists around him. Norman Osborn and Dr. Octopus help. And I loved those scenes. That's so good because that's so in character and that is what they would do. These are people that would help others. Not necessarily Norman Osborn, but Dr. Octopus would. And I loved that these people were helping one another. For a movie filled with a ton of villains, it doesn't feel bloated or overstuffed because they're utilized in ways that you're not expecting. And that is so refreshing. And I loved that. Then inevitably the Goblin reemerges, and Willem Dafoe gets to take on the bad guy, or take on Peter, while some of the other bad guys try to do stuff that's just morally centered for themselves, i.e. Electro wants the power and gets a hold of an arc reactor, and Sandman is always kind of like just a little on the fearful side. He flees. That's what he does. And so we see what happens there with all this stuff. And it comes to a slug fight between Norman Osborn and Peter. Aunt May gets caught in a crossfire and gets hit with the glider. In the moment that happened, I was like, I've seen that thing kill 2 people before, and I know exactly what's going to happen now. But we had a beautiful moment where she didn't. She stood up, and and Peter is speaking of wanting revenge, and she lectures him and says, with great power comes great responsibility. But it's not in the same way that Uncle Ben told Peter in Spider-Man 1. You don't get the same story of the consequences of Peter's actions resulted in Ben's death, which is why he says with great power comes great responsibility, something he misunderstood that was foreshadowing an event that ended with the death of Ben that would form the rest of Peter's life. And the variant that Martin Sheen says in The Amazing Spider-Man. No, this is something where he's lecturing, or where Aunt May is lecturing Peter on the meaning of being a hero to another person. You can't let your prejudices bother you. It is your responsibility when you see people who need help, and you have the power to do that, to help them. Even if they're not good people. You still need to try. And that is her imparting wisdom as she dies. And I liked that it's a different lesson learned for Peter. That touched me incredibly emotionally. And I was like crying. This is the brilliance of the writing. This is the brilliance of Kevin Feige brings to this story. He doesn't rehash what we've been given before. Peter learns an entirely different lesson with great power comes great responsibility from Aunt May than he learned with either of the Uncle Bens. And it's brilliant and it's beautiful. But Peter runs, because that's what he does. Sorry, my cat is losing his mind, so if you're hearing noises, that's him. He's actually attacking my shadow. Anyway, so that is what the lesson that he learns from Aunt May is. Moving on from that, Peter flees. And that's when MJ and Ned see that they just wish they could see Peter. They see the aftermath of what happened at the apartment that Peter was at, and they get word of what happened with Aunt May. And they just want to see Peter. That's all they want to see. So Ned is like, I just wish we could see him. But he's wearing Doctor Strange's little thing, and he has a little magic in his blood that I'm sure they're going to explore later if these characters linger within the MCU. I'll touch on that at the end. And then we're given a brilliant moment. And I have listened to people people's reactions. I'm gifted in that I work in an establishment where I can hear people's reactions to this moment, and I've timed it, and I try to hear it at least once a day, because the swell of the crowd is incredible when you see Spider-Man in the alleyway, and then he runs through the portal, and about a third, like about 3% of the audience understand it immediately and are like, and then the moment that he pulls off his mask to reveal Andrew Garfield, the collective like gasp of the audience is stunning. And you have a scene where Andrew Garfield gets to explore his qualities that he was never able to do in his own two movies because they just mishandled his character. Without changing almost anything about his character is handled so much better in one scene of this movie than he was handled in two movies that are over 2 hours long apiece. It's excellent, and he's so good at it. His comedic beats, his playing off MJ, who's throwing the buns at him, it's excellent. And then we get the second moment, where they want to see the real Peter Parker. And who comes through is Tobey. Tobey Maguire comes back. And when Tobey comes back, there's cheers 100% of the time. Every time I've watched it, when I watched it by myself, or not by myself, when I watched it in an audience wide for the first time, there was applause. There was the gasp of Garfield, the applause of Tobey. Every time I get a chance to see that moment again in person and just listen for the gasp and the cheer, it's stunning. It's amazing. This is what movies are made of, and this is why you should see these movies in the theaters, where they're supposed to be seen by a collective, engaged audience. And seeing Tobey brought back, that one moved me, because he's always been my Spider-Man, in the sense that I think those first two movies are two of the strongest comic book movies ever. I think Spider-Man 2 is the single greatest comic book movie ever made. Seeing that character brought back and capturing his wholesomeness to a T was inspiring. And you really get to see... my concern was that they were each going to have a cameo and that was it. But it's not. They get to be characters in and of themselves, the same characters from their own universes, forced into this movie with the Peter Parker we've been following for 5.5 movies at the point of this runtime. And they get to have characters themselves. For a whole hour, they have runtime together, and it's amazing. It is just jaw-dropping. This is fan service done right. I don't think this would have happened if the fans didn't really want to see that coming out of Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse. The fact that they did, and the fact that the filmmakers chose that if this is possibly the last MCU collaboration with Spider-Man, we should make a love letter to the Spider-Man franchise, and in a smart move by Sony, who's like, if we're gonna retain this character, we're gonna remind you of what we've handled with the character before, for better or worse. We're gonna bring Garfield and show you how great we did at casting him and capturing a voice for him. And we're gonna give you Tobey, who was so perfect in the embodiment of that incarnation of Spider-Man. And we're going to remind you that we as a studio were able to do this 5 times. And yep, Disney, MCU had their Peter for 5 full movies before returning for another collaboration. But if we're going to retain the character back, which I think in the writing process that was very much the case, you're going to get an excellent job with it. And we're going to instill trust in you that we can do it again. And they did. Like, I thought that the use of Toby and Andrew in this film is excellent, especially on the rooftop where Peter has his moment. It's not driven for comedy. Too many of these MCU movies don't allow dramatic weight to really resonate. This movie isn't that. It allows the dramatic weight to resonate after Peter loses May. And the only people that can console him, yeah, MJ can be there for him, and Ned can try to be there for him as well, but neither of them can understand what he's going through. The only person who can understand what he's going through is Peter Parker. And it's through having a conversation with Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker on the loss of Gwen Stacy, and with Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker on the loss of Uncle Ben, that he is able to put into perspective the loss of Aunt May and the emotional words, with great power come great responsibility. And it's wonderful. And the three of them, the three Peters, Peter Parker himself, Peter Parker cubed, if you will, comes together in order to solve the problem. And the problem isn't to be solved with violent revenge, even though one of the Peters very much wants that. The problem to be solved is curing these people, because these are failings that both Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker feel weighted on themselves as well. Like, granted, some of them did achieve a certain level of redemption with the villains, but some of them they didn't, and those characters died, and that weights on their conscience as well. We're talking about Green Goblin, and we're talking about Electro, the two characters that are very pointedly, exclusively villains in this film. So, the three Peters come together to work it out, and work it out they do. It's Peter Parker using his own intellect, his own variance of intellect, to resolve the problem. And that scene of the three Peters working together is perfect, and the best thing that has been in any MCU Spider-Man movie. This is the best MCU Spider-Man solo outing, and this is the best use of Spider-Man since Spider-Man 2. So, that is high praise. Kicking the movie along so I can speed through this a little bit more. The final battle starts, and the three Peters come together as Spider-Men. And here's another slight flaw I had. You have three distinct looking costumes, but the way the film photographs and the fact that they photograph it at night makes it really hard to tell the three Peters apart. Yeah, you can hear their voices, but oftentimes their voices are overlapping, so it doesn't really fly. And I think they could have done a little more work, especially with the camera, to differentiate the three Peters. You could have done some very Raimi-esque movements with camera whenever you were working with Toby. And you could have done some Mark movements of camera. Mark did sweep shots and stuff like that while keeping Peter at center focus in his action scenes. You could have done that, but instead all three of them are filmed. The Watts style and the Watts visual language isn't very strong, as I think I mentioned in the previous discussion of Spider-Man and the MCU. More on that later. Lastly, I want to talk about how this final battle plays out. You have them each trying to save their villains, and you have the beautiful moment where Tobey Maguire is able to save Sandman, and I loved that moment, the cure of Sandman, and it instills you with hope that maybe he can reconnect with his daughter if he were to go back. The fact that Lizard is saved yet again in this movie. A little redundant, but it works. The fact that Doc Ock comes not as a villain to the final fight, but he comes as a hero. and he comes to work with Spider-Man. And I loved that. That is so him. He's already had his redemption arc earlier in the film, and he really culminates because he plays the bad guys. And in a beautiful listen to me now moment for this film. And I loved that. Alfred Molina, man, for the win. The threats still out there are Jamie Foxx and Willem Dafoe. Jamie Foxx goes up against Doc Ock and gets cured himself, and he has a sweet moment with Andrew Garfield, who takes off the mask, and they have their beautiful moment that I think is really quite strong, and it hints at Miles Morales. Then you have finally the showdown between Spider-Man, the MCU Spider-Man, and Willem Dafoe, the Green Goblin. And he allows the rage to overtake. This is the one he wants to kill. And it's so beautiful that Tobey Maguire is the one that stops him, because he was the one that held that same rage for the man that killed Uncle Ben. This was also the man who held that same rage towards the Sandman, who also killed Uncle Ben. The man he believed to kill Uncle Ben, the man who actually pulled the trigger. And also the man at the end of the movie who, at the end of the very first movie, who makes the threat against MJ and causes Peter to stand tall and fight the Green Goblin, which ends in the Green Goblin's death. Peter has gone through this before, and he knows that our universe Peter is going through that now, and he knows he needs to stop it, and he is the one that stops the glider. But in traditional MCU fashion, his immense act of heroism is undercut with the stabbing of Tobey Maguire. And that scene, oh boy, did that hurt. I was convinced he was going to die. I was a little sad that his emotional moment was kind of undercut with, I've been stabbed before. But I was also happy that he just didn't die. I thought it was a beautiful moment. There's so many beautiful moments between the three Peters in the end of the movie. And I like how they capture the unique voices without changing anything. You have the hopeful optimism of the wholesome Tobey Maguire, that every one of his line readings reads true, but he also feels authentic to that character that has lived through a really rough time. But hopeful optimism drives him. Then you have the self-deprecating Andrew Garfield, who's like gripped by emotion that just always is pulling him down. And how these are kind of like the devil and angel on Tom Holland's shoulders, because he's a balance between the two, and this movie really does wonders to sell that balance. Anyway, the final confrontation between Norman and the Peters is great, and his cure feels beautiful and earned, and I loved it. The fact that his first thoughts when we first meet Norman are about his son is beautiful, because his son never believed that in those three movies. That line always took it away from me. And the fact that you can watch this movie knowing that he's potentially going back to a universe where he can reconnect with that son, that's what I loved about this. This movie wasn't about fan service in the traditional sense. Yeah, it offers a fair amount of fan service, but it delivers in such a way that it creates this hopeful optimism for the movies that you're familiar with, that maybe they'll play out a little bit differently. Now that we live in a world where those movies can have different, happier endings because of what the Peters came together to do in this one. And I love that. But the world starts cracking. Doctor Strange is back. The world starts cracking. We start seeing cameos from a bunch of other different villains. Rhino I saw was coming through, and Kraven and Black Cat and stuff like that. You can see a Scorpion is there. Like, you can see a lot of the different ones. I can't wait to get this on home video so I can just pause the shit out of that scene and see all the different cameos that are coming through. Peter realizes the thing he needs to do. He needs to go through it. That he needs everybody to forget Peter Parker. I do question whether or not this is fucking up everything he did for this movie and sending back the other Peters. Is everybody going to forget about them too? But I digress. He makes this sacrifice, but Doctor Strange allows him to say goodbye to the people that are important to him. And they have a beautiful goodbye moment. And then he goes and says bye to Ned, and he says bye to MJ. In the most sweeping, beautiful, romantic goodbye ever. And then the spell happens, and people forget. But he has this plan, and he's going to go, and he's going to tell MJ. And when he goes and he meets her in that cafe at the end of the movie, he sees how much better her life is without him in it. And he allows to let her exist in a world where Peter Parker doesn't. He allows the same for Ned, and he allows the same for Happy. It's beautiful. It's epic. And it is the most heroic thing I've seen Spider-Man do. And that's saying a lot. This is the origin story of Spider-Man. Independent of any friends or anybody else. This is him having learned to live on his own and rely on himself. It's not lost on me that the last shot is of him putting down a box where he's trying to get his own GED. This is how you end high school. These three movies are about the high school experience, right? You follow him as a sophomore, a junior. This is senior year. And senior year is preparing you to grow up and to move away from that is familiar. He rounds out his life by getting his GED, or trying to anyway, making his own costume, no longer relying on Stark technology, nothing like that. He makes his own costume in a movie that is incredibly brave from like 20 years ago. I was watching the scene where he's literally just in self-made tights, and I'm like, 20 years ago, X-Men came out, and that movie was so embarrassed of being a comic book movie, it refused to let anybody wear tights. The X-Men didn't look like the X-Men, they looked like a bunch of like models in leather suits, almost fetishistic in some sense. This movie embraces. We've come to a point in our culture where everybody just embraces the costumes. And he wears a shiny blue and red costume, and he goes swinging in the only scene that I think is photographed elegantly and excellently. It is so Raimi of him swinging through the city and whatnot right at the very end of the movie at Christmas. It's stunning, and I love it. It's an excellent way to go out. This is almost a 4-star movie. If only the first half hour had been a little better, if only there weren't scenes that you could shake out, and if only Venom didn't show up in the fucking mid-credit scene to ruin the fuck out of my life. He's the sixth of the Sinister Six, ladies and gentlemen. The Venom Tom Hardy shows up, and as irritating as ever. I don't get it. I don't get why people enjoy this incarnation of the character. He's not close to his comic book counterpart. He is not funny in the least. He's obnoxious and annoying, played by an exquisite actor. Tom Hardy is amazing, and he gives it his all. I'll say that. But hot damn, it's dumb. And his cameo at the end of Venom: Let There Be Carnage, Spider-Man's inclusion in that, is for nothing. Venom gets wiped into our world, and then, without having any weight of the story, gets wiped back into it. So he's not even part of the MCU proper. He does leave behind the symbiote, and that's where it's time to address this. I don't know if we're going to see Spider-Man in the MCU anymore. At least when this was written, I don't think that was necessarily the intent. The intent was to get Peter on his own. Aunt May is not there. You never have to include MJ or Ned ever again. Happy doesn't know who he is. None of the other characters do. You could weave him into a Sony universe of his own characters for the rest of his eternity, and nothing, it would have no bearing on anything that happened in the MCU. They wrote him out perfectly. And I kind of almost feel like they shouldn't bring him back. This is the perfect ending. It's a melancholy ending for Peter Parker, but it is perfect. So, I think this was the separation. That said, it sounds like Sony and Marvel, MCU Marvel is on good terms, and they're going to try and include him once more, but even Tom Holland doesn't necessarily seem like he's itching to come back because of how perfectly thematically wrapped up this movie was. And it would be really kind of hard to go anywhere from this that wouldn't seem disingenuous to what his character went through in this film. So there's that. That said, a piece of the symbiote gets left behind by Venom so that we can include into the MCU proper. It's important to note, Eddie Brock isn't the only one who has the symbiote. There are other characters that do, and so we could utilize that. One of the characters becomes a fucking Guardian of the Galaxy. How cool would it be to have Venom in the Guardians of the Galaxy, yo? I'm excited for that. If that's the direction that they go, if they choose to explore that, holy shit, son, I am there, man. So, yeah. There was that. The last point that I want to talk about, and my last criticism of this movie ends with a trailer for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and it looks fucking pimp. It looks so good. It looks perfect. I loved it. It was amazing. I cannot wait for that movie. But something stuck out like a sore thumb. Throughout the entire 2.5-hour movie that I was watching, I noticed that John Watts does nothing with the camera. He does utilize close-ups in this a little stronger than he ever did in the past, and really allows emotion to hang in the air. And he allows scenes to play out. But his camera work has nothing to write home about. Never has been, and the fact that you have a post-credit scene in this that's directed by Sam Raimi himself, who directed 3 Spider-Man movies. Say what you will about the quality of them, you can't deny the visual presence that he brought to those movies. And in a single post-credit trailer, you get that same visual energy for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And it makes the whole rest of the movie stick out like a sore thumb. Like, yeah, there's some really cool bits of this film that were definitely pre-Viz special effects artist stuff like that's happening with Doctor Strange that look kind of neat, but the camera was not a good character in those scenes. The use of camera as character in the Doctor Strange post-credit is pure Sam Raimi, and it looks great, and it really makes the rest of this movie stick out like a sore thumb. I keep saying that, but it's true. Nobody quite knows how to shoot a movie like Raimi does. The heroic shots of people standing into frame, like you see with Wong. The fact that the world is spinning this way and the camera's spinning the other way while Doctor Strange opens the door into the giant void. The framing of objects in the screen with like the watch that has the same look as the time stone capsule thing of the emblem, the Eye of Agamotto or whatever it is. All of that is just visually rich, visually stunning, and in 2 minutes made the whole movie that you watched leading up to that, sans the last 20 seconds where Spider-Man is swinging through this the skyline of New York. It just rendered it all ugly in comparison. So, that's a short way of me saying, I really liked Spider-Man No Way Home. I hope you did too. And it's also a really strong way of saying, I'm really excited for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. I can't wait, guys. This movie is incredible. Let me know what your favorite part of this movie. Was there anything I didn't cover? I think I talked about this movie for like fucking an hour, so I'm sure I covered everything. But was there anything that you loved about this movie? Please drop them in the comments below. Hit like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Share this with your friends. Share the love, man. That's what I gotta say. Thanks for watching, and peace.